Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Saṅghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi. So hope that everybody is keeping well wherever might be. And I've come down here to Danaukonda Aranya, which is in Gampaha. It's a lovely monastery with some forest here. And I've got this nice kuti with a view of the forest, so it's a great place to be, to practice. So I was asked a question a few days ago about the difference between, basically about the difference between conventional and ultimate reality, touching on that point. And so I'll try to paraphrase the question as best I can and give an answer. So the question was basically, as far as I understand it, there's conventional and ultimate reality. And most people will go through life only experiencing the conventional reality. But for people who know the Abhidhamma and practice Vipassana meditation, I think it specifically said Vipassana, they'll see ultimate reality. And then there was a follow-up part to the question, which was that sometimes there are moments of clarity when using the Mahasi technique, which encourages this person to go onwards, but can also be like quite a lot of like agitation or distraction or something like this. Just paraphrasing from what I remember. And so one of the things to know about this difference between conventional and ultimate reality is that this is not a principle that's really explicitly spelled out in the canon. There are these suttas which, say things like an arahant wouldn't perceive somebody as better or worse or equal. But then also you're to go and find people who are better to associate with. There's another sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya talking about arahants, and it says, basically, if one who's finished their task, would they still say like, I see or I do, like referring to I, just paraphrasing here again. And if they do that, are there defilements, will defilements re-arise in them, more or less? And the Buddha says no. And so what you have here is what seems to be a distinction between like a conventional reality and an ultimate reality. So one of the things about this is that this seeming distinction got really puffed up, really blown up in the time of the creation of the Abhidhammas. So when a person comes to practice, actually, one doesn't necessarily have to think of these things as like levels of reality. If a person says, I know or I see, it's not that they're referring to a conventional existence when there's nothing philosophically behind that. There's just nothing to discuss behind that. The Buddha left that kind of question more or less aside. And his answers to it, or you might say not even his answers to it, the way that he approached it is what you might call teleological. It's aimed at an end. It's aimed at putting an end to suffering rather than answering this type of question, kind of describing, giving an ultimate overview of reality. So what we see with these kind of statements like I have a I am, I see, or I do, these kind of things, it's something very obvious if you come to practice. You just have to use language to refer to what you're experiencing and what you're doing so that other people can understand what you're saying. It doesn't necessarily then mean that a person is feeding off of those things in the sense of attaching to them, in the sense of their mind. And, I have this view that I own them. They're a part of me. They're a permanent part of myself. And they're inalienable. They're never going to fall away. You can still say this is mine, and it means like legally you're the owner. So again, you could see this in a sense as being like a split between conventional and ultimate reality. But one doesn't actually have to see it as a split between conventional and ultimate reality. One is speaking, and the way that one says mine or I do this or I that, I do this or I that, one is referring to that in the way that it's referred to in the context of the Buddhist suttas, in the context of the Buddhist teachings. In other words, one knows that the Buddhist teachings don't teach that form is self, or feeling is self, or these various things are self, or even my sandals are myself, or my body is myself, or that I own it in the sense that I can stop it from doing whatever, from changing, or I can cause it to do whatever I want it to do. And these are some of the concepts behind ownership. These are some of the concepts that occur behind ownership. People think they are something or they own something, so they have a certain amount of control over it. But just using the language, this is mine, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, it doesn't necessarily have to have these concepts bound up in it. So one doesn't even have to see the language used in the canon as a distinction between like a conventional and ultimate reality. You can be referring to I go here and I do this, or I'm doing this, or I'm going to do that. And it can just be referred to in the Buddhist sense. And so it doesn't necessarily have to imply that there's this whole other ultimate reality behind that one is just foregoing, or one is not using the appropriate exact language for. So that's one aspect. Similarly with the things where somebody's better to me, equal to me, or worse than me. So for an arahant who's relinquished all attachments, for somebody who's completed the path, then they don't attach even to time. They don't even attach to present or past or future. There's nothing that they can attach to. There's nothing that one can define them by. And so they don't perceive people as being like better or equal or worse than them. But in terms of the qualities that a person is looking to develop, arahants can still go and develop more qualities. And they can, they might be able to develop more psychic powers, or they might be able to refine their understanding of the Vinaya. And so in that sense, they know that there's people who may have more skills than them or less skills than them. People who have less skills, they may be able to help or may be able to teach. But what you might say is that in terms of their equality, it's not like a person thinks, because I have these skills, in an ultimate sense, I'm better, and that there's something in me, innate in me, that makes me better, and that's permanent, that's lasting. But again, one doesn't have to see this necessarily as some distinction between an ultimate and conventional reality. When one uses the terms, this person has more skills or less, one is using them in the context of the Buddhist suttas, in the context of the Buddhist teachings, which just basically means that this person actually does have more skills than me. But it doesn't mean that I perceive these skills that this person has as coming from some permanent source, some permanent aspect of personality, which is really who I am, and that won't change, that I have control over. So this distinction between ultimate and conventional isn't specifically spelled out in the canon. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be seen as like a real distinction. One can perceive the way that these languages are used in the context which they're used in the suttas, which is clear enough. It's kind of some of the examples we just went over. And there can be others too. So where this kind of took off was in the centuries after the Buddha's parinibbana. The various schools arose in Theravada Buddhism. And these schools created Abhidhammas. So actually the word Abhidhamma, now we can search the entire canon, as far as I've been able to find anyway, it basically only shows up in the Bhikkhuni Patimokkha once. And you wonder how it's even there. So mostly they refer to the Matakas. And these Matakas are like very practical lists of qualities that are already given in the canon. They're like headings, like kusala dhamma, akusala dhamma, these kind of things, and like dependent origination and forward and reverse order, and then the various khandas and the various sense bases and, contact and these kind of things. It's like they seem to be mainly like lists of terms and concepts, headings, which is basically, I think, what matika means, that serve as a shorthand for things that the Buddha has already explained in detail. So these matikas got expanded and they became the Abhidhammas of these various schools. And these various schools would fight with each other on the basis of their Abhidhammas. So we know about some of them. Some of their doctrines may be more or less lost in antiquity, as some of their documents have been destroyed in the shifting historical circumstances of ancient India. But some of the ones we do know. We do know what their Abhidhammas were. We do know a lot about what they taught. One of the big debates that was happening at the time was about the existence of dhammas. So dhammas were these kind of little building blocks of realities. The Buddha refers to them like in an offhand way, usually contextually. It kind of means like phenomenon, but it's not really spelled out. He refers to them kind of contextually. The Abhidhammas kind of took these dhammas and ran with them. So there was one school that said that they were basically permanent, that they kind of came together and their coming together of them and what their interactions were impermanent, but there's this underlying fundamental reality that always exists. Then there's another school that says something different, like that the ones that are present are existing, the ones that have passed and so on have not existed. And there was another kind of debate that was going on about whether there was a kind of subtle person or not a subtle person. And they called them the Pudgalavadins, these people who had a doctrine that the Buddhist path implied that there had to be like some kind of subtle receiver of kamma, a subtle person. They called it a Pudgala, but it didn't necessarily mean like a self that would be able to receive the kamma that one did now in the future, and that would be able to be a repository for the advancements that one was making on the path. They said that actually the Buddhist doctrine of kamma would require such a thing, because otherwise, who's going to receive it? Then you had other schools who would argue against this. So the school that Theravadins come from now, myself being a Theravadin monk, is coming, we're called the Vibhajavadins. The Vibhajavadins are the distinctionists. They make a distinction, so they don't necessarily say that that all dhammas are existing all the time. Some of these kind of phenomenon, they don't have to exist all the time. They can only maybe they just exist in the present when they come up. And these are just very loose descriptions of their doctrines. I actually haven't really studied them in detail. And another one is this kind of this thing with the person. So actually in the Theravada Abhidhamma, it takes this position that there's this conventional reality where you say that there's a person or whatever, but ultimately there's only these 3 or 4 realities in the Abhidhamma, the things that are actually real. Other things are like an illusion that's created by the coming together of things, kind of not permanent. So it comes from the Abhidhamma that you have these kind of divisions into ultimate and conventional reality. And it has this historical context of debates between these different schools about the nature of reality and the nature of dhammas. One of the interesting things is that the Buddha actually explicitly sometimes says to put questions like this aside, whether the world is infinite, whether it's finite, whether the cosmos is eternal, not eternal. These, these types of questions are questions that lead to what he calls a thicket of views. In other words, they lead to a whole lot of thinking that doesn't get one out of samsara. So this leads to another important point about the reason why the Buddha taught and the way that he taught. So we're talking a little bit about conventional and ultimate reality. So the Buddha's purpose in teaching was to lead people to nibbana. And so there wasn't an ulterior purpose, like he wanted to lay out a full schema of reality for people, so that they could, know what was really real or what really wasn't real. And his purpose in teaching was to lead people onward step by step so that they would experience the cessation of suffering themselves. So it's with this kind of knowledge in mind that we can understand why there's ambiguities in the Buddha's teaching. And if one comes to actually try to practice the Buddha's teaching, some of these things are actually not that important. Kind of, like whether this step is made up of 45 different elements and how many cetasikas or mental states go into perceiving it is not important. What's important in the Buddhist sense of reality, or in the Buddhist sense of what makes up reality, is how much we like it and how much we attach to it. So ignorance in terms of these Abhidhamma concepts can sometimes come across as meaning that one is ignorant of what the ultimate reality is. Ignorance in the way that it's used in the Pali Canon, or the way that the Buddha generally teaches it, it basically means that we don't see things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. In other words, we see things as being desirable that actually cause us to suffer, and we're doing it all the time. The mind operates on this process of addiction. Somebody who's addicted to alcohol, they perceive that the alcohol will make them happy, even though time and again when they drink it, their life gets worse. There's an actual covering up that goes on in the mind when a person indulges in these habits. They're looking to forget. They're looking to ignore, and there's a part of their mind that's operating when they indulge in them that's causing them to suffer that they don't want to see because they like one part of it. This is fundamentally more or less what ignorance means in the Buddhist sense. It means that we don't see things for what they are. We don't see things that cause us to suffer for what they are, and so we attach to them. We grab onto them, and we suffer because of that. This is what seeing means, more or less. And people can debate about the terms here, but ignorance means this, and destroying ignorance or seeing through ignorance means this. And kind of you see the danger, you see the allure, and you see the escape. You want to escape through dispassion. So one can see it a bit like if one has a wife or a husband that one really loves, and then there's all these things that are happening in one's life that are causing one to suffer, that are making one suspicious. So one's friends maybe start to treat one differently. Money is disappearing from one's bank account. One's husband or wife disappears for long stretches of time when you want them to do things, or emotionally a person is very unsatisfied and stressed out because this person that they really think is the world to them or they care about is behaving in ways that are causing them to suffer a lot. And so then a good friend comes and says, look, your husband or wife is cheating on you. They're having an affair. And so at first you don't want to believe it. You don't want to divorce them just on that hearsay. So you go and investigate. You might notice sometimes, they said they were at the kids' PTA meeting or whatever it was, but when I went to the PTA meeting, they weren't there. And I asked other people, they weren't there. That's suspicious. And so you keep investigating until things become more and more blatant, until you uncover more and more evidence. But it's sometimes not until the day that one catches their partner in the act that they actually realize this person is really cheating on me. And they see that for themselves. That's when dispassion sets in. And they don't want, they become disgusted with their or with their wife or husband and want to divorce them. And kind of their feelings change towards them. This person who I thought was mine, who I thought was doing good things for me, is not mine. In fact, they're causing me to suffer. Ignorance is like the person who's in love with their partner and keeps holding on to them when they're suffering, when they're causing them suffering. Wisdom is this investigation that eventually leads one to uncover what they're doing. And the letting go that happens is through dispassion, when one actually sees, wait a minute, the things that I've been grabbing onto are causing me to suffer. So this is an important distinction. Ignorance in the terms of the Pali Canon, we don't have to look at it in that people are ignorant of some ultimate reality that's out there that we're not able to see. That if we just awoke to this ultimate reality, then our suffering would be gone. Ignorance means we like things that cause us to suffer, and we can't let go of them because we build up perceptions to the opposite, because we distract ourselves when we consume them, because we enjoy them. The ending of ignorance means being able to cut off that craving, cut off the attachment for these things, for everything, for an arahant. So, Vipassana meditation in the canon is not necessarily called Vipassana. They're often called sanya topics, perception topics, anicca sanya. dukkha sanya, anatta sanya. These are perceptions you bring up again and again to counter the perceptions that this thing is pleasurable, this thing is mine, this thing will last, because these are the things that cause a person to suffer. And where the danger in this is that actually sometimes people study a lot about these kind of concepts in the Abhidhamma or whatever it might be, and they think it's like really, really high, really, really important philosophy. But what sometimes even happens is people study this so much and then they don't even keep sila. And it's like, well, sila is a convention. I don't have to keep it because I'm already, have this knowledge of what ultimate reality is. So in this case, their knowledge has not contributed to dispassion really in any way, or in a significant way. In fact, their knowledge has been hijacked by their defilements to make them do things that are against the Buddha's teachings. So you can just imagine it this way. I mean, if you know that your wife is built of 46 cetasikas and, however many 24 kinds of form that, people have just come up with and divided into these things, it won't necessarily make you dispassionate towards them. And your dispassion comes when you see how your attachment to them has been causing you to suffer. So this is where the Buddha's teachings lead. This is where wisdom and investigation leads. This is where what we might call sanya topics, not necessarily vipassana, although you can use that word, there's sanya topics mainly in the canon. This is where it leads. We cultivate perceptions to the opposite to help us see what's really going on, how we're creating a reality in which things that cause us to suffer are desirable for us. So an Abhidhamma practitioner or a Vipassana practitioner, it's not necessarily the case that they're seeing some type of ultimate reality. Actually, these cetasikas and these things that are in the Abhidhamma, they're not really mentioned so much in the canon. So we don't know if they're an ultimate reality or not. There's these rumors that it's that the Buddha taught the Abhidhamma to his mother in the Tusita heaven. Can't really confirm or deny that. Maybe it's true. But if that's the case, it's mainly for devas with immaterial bodies who contemplate on these kind of things. We don't know. But in any event, what we can look at is the process in which we create a reality. And if we are developing perceptions that this thing is made up of these different elements, these chaitasikas, in looking for those chaitasikas, we make them real. We can make them real. In looking for discrete moments of consciousness, I can't remember what they're called, we can make them real. That is the perception that we're cultivating about reality. We're cultivating this perception and we learn to perceive reality in that particular way. So just because a person, it's interesting, sometimes you have conversations with meditators and they'll say, I had this or that experience or this or that experience, and was it good? It's like, well, I don't know. Did it lead to dispassion or not? Right? It's kind of, did your defilements decrease or not? Because we can cultivate all different types of perceptions and have, neat experiences where, the world seems divided up into these things, or if we cultivate perceptions of light, one might see light all kinds of different places, or one might even have real perceptions of other beings or something like this. However, we have to understand that a lot of the way that we perceive reality is because of perceptions that we're actively cultivating. So if we take up the Abhidhamma, and we take up cetasikas, and we take these up for a meditation topic, and we try to cultivate perceptions that they're there and look for them, we may create them. And it's kind of a neutral thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're becoming really advanced on the path or we're seeing an ultimate reality. We're cultivating particular perceptions. So the follow-up question to this is, are these perceptions leading to dispassion or not? So it's not necessarily like the Abhidhamma is like, not trying to say it's some terrible thing or, it's horrible or something like this. Actually, if you are becoming dispassionate from cultivating perceptions about the impermanence of chaitasikas or the impermanence of whatever different ways the Abhidhamma breaks up form and all these different things, then it can be a good thing. It's possible that it's a good thing. But it's important to know the distinction. And it's important to know what's going on. So as far as the Mahasi method goes, one can't really necessarily say that it's like it's a bad thing to note, or it's a good thing to do this noting technique. It's important to know what's going on. You're putting a label on something. That label temporarily separates your mind from that object, and it may lead to beneficial results. However, There may also be cases in which it's an inappropriate approach to apply. The litmus test for these things is whether a person's defilements are increasing or decreasing, whether their wholesome qualities are increasing or decreasing. How are you using this tool? And how does it feel to you? The Buddha gives this important teaching on the simile of the cook and finding what he calls the chitta nimitta, or the theme of the mind. In other words, a good cook watches what he puts out. He watches what his master takes. If his master takes more of one curry, he puts out more of that curry, and he gets rewarded with wages. And in a similar way, a skillful meditator notices the theme of their mind. What topic, when they take it up for practice and cultivation, leads to the decrease of their defilements, leads to calm, leads to insight, in the terms that we've been talking about, dispassion. So you don't want to grab onto the things that you are grabbing onto that cause to suffer. If one finds something that is good in this way, that feels good in this way, then one should cultivate it more. And this is like the skillful cook. One will be rewarded in that case with what the Buddha calls a pleasant abiding here and now, or with insight that leads to the letting go of the things that have been causing us to suffer. So if the Mahasi technique is making one very, very agitated, then one might want to consider whether or not it's the suitable way for one to meditate. Actually, this is one of the dangers of this modern, technique-based meditation culture that sometimes arises, is that people's minds are not like a factory. You can't take every single mind, stick it through an assembly line, and expect every mind to come out the same way. The mind is one of the most complicated things in the world. It's the most quickly changing. It's the most difficult thing to train. And it requires a skill. It requires much more than just continually going back to a technique, whether it's working or not. So one has to evaluate in terms of the criteria that the Buddha gives. Is this leading me to wholesome states? How does it feel when I do it? Does it feel like food that when I eat it is good? The Buddha also gives other similes, like the simile of the goldsmith, like the simile where a goldsmith has to sometimes watch the gold with equanimity, sometimes he has to blow on it, sometimes he has to sprinkle water on it to cool it down. How is one approaching one's meditation topic? What qualities is one bringing to bear? What is one bringing to bear? The quality of calm, the quality of energy, the quality of equanimity, and are these qualities in correct proportion? And one might have to adjust the amount of equanimity one's bringing to one's meditation practice if one feels agitation or it's not working out. Or maybe it's that one isn't putting in enough effort. Now these are things that one has to evaluate oneself. And over time, one gets one's own schema, one's own map of what one's personality is like, what one's good qualities and bad qualities are like. And this allows one to move forward on one's own, choosing the appropriate methods and learning step by step how to develop those qualities that overcome one's hindrances. Now meditation is a skill. It requires a lot of different approaches, a lot of different efforts. That's why these qualities are quite important, rather than a technique. So one other thing that might say about techniques in general, there can sometimes be this view expressed in the Abhidhamma, or possibly expressed in the Abhidhamma, that underlying or between the gaps of conscious thought, there's what they call the bhavanga. And sometimes something like this can be perceived as nibbana. So in other words, you might have a technique where you're trying to look for a gap in thoughts, and then that gap, if you drop into it, is seen as nibbana. There is a meditative state called asanyi, which is mentioned in the canon. And this is a perceptionless state. It's a state where one doesn't perceive or feel or anything like this. It's like a blank out. And people can even program themselves to go into that and come out of it at specific times. Now, Ajahn Thanissaro has a very nice article that he wrote about it in Tricycle, I think a long time ago, in 1996. So in any event, it's not to make comments about the specific experiences of individuals. That's for them to evaluate. But it's important to know that if one is taking up a technique that advocates that there's this bhavanga, and if one has this experience where one drops into it, then one has become a sotapanna, or one's become an anagami, or whatever it might be. Then one wants to take that and evaluate it closely. One wants to evaluate the conditions about what a sotapanna is, about what these various things are that are listed in the suttas, and compare one's experience to that. Because just because one is watching the breath and looking for gaps in between thoughts, if one suddenly disappears into the gap it doesn't mean that it's a path and fruition moment. So in these kind of techniques, especially a technique that advocates that, one has to be careful. This is another thing that's also there in the Abhidhamma that is not expressed in the canon. So one wants to watch out and be one's own judge, one's own evaluator. So in terms of conventional and ultimate reality, the main thing to know about realities and the way that we don't see reality is we don't see the things in reality that are causing us to suffer as undesirable enough that dispassion sets in. This is where ignorance is. This is where we misperceive. This is where we sometimes build up a reality that's permanent, that's nice, that's whatever it is, and we don't want to look at it. We don't want to look at it when the times are good, when we're lost in a feeling, when we're lost in an event, when we're lost in a moment. We don't want to think about how it will end. And because of that, we suffer. This is the reality that we're living in. A reality where being born again is useful, where being born again is desirable, where our body is something that will give us lasting happiness that's ours, that's beautiful. This is a reality where we have perceptions that are blatantly opposed and one doesn't want to look. So it's here that one should look for the gaps in reality. These are the recommendations in the canon. Examine the body. Examine what you think is beautiful. Examine what you think is mine, the things that you really like that cause you to suffer, and see why it is you're still holding on to them. In this way, eventually dispassion can set in, like the man who investigates or woman who investigates and finds their spouse with another person. Sometimes it's only when something so blatant happens that finally one can let go of the burden and be free of some of the things that cause one to suffer. So this is the important thing to investigate in reality, so that our defilements fall away and so that we actually do move forward on the path to Nibbana. Okay, so leave that for reflection. And wishing everybody all the blessings of Dhamma practice.